Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Spartan Talks. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Chen. I have the privilege of hosting Spartan Talks, and I serve as Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Northampton Community College. And we want to welcome all of you. I know for many of you, this is not your first Spartan Talk, but for those who are joining us for the first time, Spartan Talks is a TED Talk-like platform here at Northampton Community College, through which we are able to highlight the research and work of our elite faculty, especially our adjunct faculty, and also give our students an opportunity to meet faculty that they can potentially take classes from in the future, and really give our community an opportunity to learn more about topics that honestly have fascinated so many of us, but we don't always have the time to do all the research for. Today is one of those topics I'm very excited about this morning's Spartan Talk, and it's a privilege for me to get to introduce our guest speaker today. Our guest speaker is John Parks. He serves as Adjunct Professor of History here at Northampton Community College, teaching U.S. History 1. His research interests in history are the early modern British Empire, patristic theology and its relationship to modern philosophy, and post-World War II American deep politics, which is what he'll be diving into a little bit today. John got his bachelor's degree from Lafayette College before becoming a turncoat and going to Lehigh University for his graduate work, where he's currently finishing his doctorate. His talk today is El Norte, Cocaine, Contras, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And it's a talk that pursues the deep politics of American geopolitics in relation to a larger global drug trafficking. He's going to be focusing on Barry Seal as a central figure, the web between American political actors, both elected and unelected, anti-communist paramilitaries, underworld criminals, and corporate finance. They all become visible for analysis. It's the buried history of America's Cold War drug politics. I'm certainly fascinated by this, and so I know you didn't come to hear me talk, and so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor John Parks.
So this talk is going to be pretty lightning fast because I'm limited to 25 minutes, and I could go on and on. So if you have any specific questions topically as I go through things, make sure to write them down and save them for the Q&A. And so the reason I start with Barry Seal and why I even kind of crafted this talk was because he popped up in pop culture again in the Tom Cruise-led movie American Made, right? And that's what this silly scene is, where he crashes his plane and gets covered in coke. But right, this movie, like most Hollywood, is about 60 to 70% accurate with some creative licensing. But the actual story is a lot more nefarious, complicated, and just downright interesting. So, but first, before we get to Barry Seal, I wanna kind of go through the wide context of not only American politics but Latin American politics, intelligence, kind of global business arrangements, and that how drug trafficking kind of fits in there, and how some nobody like Barry Seal ends up becoming the sort of center of a web connecting all sorts of strange figures, people you might not expect. All right, so let's get started, right? United States policy towards Latin America began, probably most crystallized in the Monroe Doctrine, which is really John Quincy Adams. But this was a continuation of George Washington's attempt to sort of stay out of foreign relations and kind of keep America on its own terrain. But as the 19th century developed and U.S. interests started to spread out beyond just the continental U.S., but also reaching into the Caribbean more thoroughly, down into Central and South America, you see this development of a kind of imperial turn in American history. And so for those who are familiar with their high school or kind of intro level history classes, this is usually kind of fixed on the Spanish-American War. But, and that itself was a development of the kind of new naval doctrine of how the United States could be present as a world power without kind of necessarily conquering and absorbing other peoples. So I could go through a whole bunch of this. I just wanted to, the numbers to sort of pop out, right? How many times the U.S. got involved, either through direct invasion or through threats of invasion. But you can just get the scale of how involved the U.S. was involved, the scale of U.S. involvement throughout Latin America, right? You get the Panama Canal, where Teddy Roosevelt basically helped a group of rebels break away from Gran Colombia. The U.S. involved several times in Nicaragua and Honduras, usually in relation to mining companies, bananas, and a few other things. But ultimately, right, without getting through all of that, Smedley Butler, who was a 4-star general in the United States Marine Corps, he had a kind of nasty wake-up call in relation to this, and he summarized it quite well, where he functionally was a racketeer. U.S. business and U.S. politics had combined into a sort of synthesis of public-private oriented to protecting American interests abroad, right? And for him, he was a gangster for the banks, for the oil companies, for the fruit companies, for mining companies, and that American foreign policy was not interested in national protection so much as maintaining these larger business arrangements. All right, so that's sort of where America is at 1945, right? Now, specifically in Nicaragua, you see the overthrow of an elected official by the name of Sandino by Anastasio Somoza, which creates a kind of, without getting too much into the context of Latin American politics, but he's functionally like a caudillo. He's this strong man. He was trained by American forces and was sort of tasked to protect Nicaraguan coffee, cotton, and the financial investment in those companies. Right. So Sandino wanted to redistribute land for the peasants, and Somoza, trained by American military officials, put an end to that. And this concept of training Latin American forces on behalf of United States interests kind of fully concretized in something that's called the School of the Americas, which taught everything from terrorism, psychological warfare, economic infractions, like how to mine a harbor to keep trade out, and in guerrilla combat skills. So the Somoza dynasty, it passes on to his son, whose also name is Anastasio Somoza. But eventually the son is too heavy-handed. He steps too hard, and he provokes a rebellion from a revolutionary group called the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas are similar to a lot of third world communist movements, which it's not communist in a doctrinaire sense. They didn't pick up Marx or Lenin per se, but they were more interested in redistributive policies towards land. And of course, that was the great problem. Who owned the land? It wasn't necessarily the peasants who worked it, and it wasn't even necessarily nationals within the country, but sometimes these were owned by multinational firms like the United Fruit Company, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the Nicaraguan Revolution over the 70s is ultimately successful, and Somoza is overthrown, and several leftovers from Somoza's military form collectively what are known as the Contras. And these Contras get the backing of the United States government to kind of take out the Sandinistas and bring Nicaragua back into the U.S. orbit. This was touted heavily by Ronald Reagan when he was elected president. He was very much invested in the Contras. Some people even say, right, there's questions about how alert and attentive Reagan was in his foreign policy meetings, but some of his aides give accounts that whenever the Contras are brought up, he would perk up and say, how my boys doing? We'll come back to some of that more later. But the point is, right, this is the the context for which the United States has a reason to be involved in this region, right? It's the threat of communism. And we'll come back to a little bit of that in just a second. Now, why would the US get involved in Nicaragua? And what was exactly the reason for the CIA to be involved in it? So this goes back to CIA policy, actually prior to the CIA in an organization known as the OSS. In the OSS, which was formed during World War II, but its origins go back to actually a lot of corporate espionage figures. That's why the Dulles brothers were involved as corporate lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell. And the head of the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan, was also a corporate lawyer, heavily involved in not only Republican Party politics in New York, but just generally forming business relations between Wall Street and other parts of Europe and Latin America, specifically, also China. Now, during the war, OSS attaches were placed in Chiang Kai-shek's army. He was a nationalist. He was fighting the Japanese. Right? He's the great enemy of Mao. He'll lose and end up on Taiwan. But for Chiang Kai-shek, what the OSS learned was the best way for him to provide for his own army, and this has deep roots to British opium trafficking back in the 19th and early 20th century. But Chiang Kai-shek wanted to fund his army, or he didn't want to, he had to. He funded his army by the sale of heroin and opium. So the OSS learned these strategies during their time in China, and they continued them as Chiang Kai-shek continued to fight the communists in China through what the CIA would, or the OSS has now changed into the CIA more or less, in 1950 with Operation Paper, which was, basically drugs for guns trade. And one of the main figures who had spent his time in the OSS was a guy named Paul Helliwell. And Helliwell, he founded this organization called the Civil Air Transport, which effectively was a CIA cutout for drug smuggling from this corner of Southeast Asia, which is southern China. It's called the Golden Triangle. But there was a lot, they would move it all down to Bangkok in Thailand, and they would ship it out to Europe and North America for processing. And this was used not just for Chiang Kai-shek in Operation Paper, but it was later developed more thoroughly into kind of broader anti-communist black ops kind of programs. And the most famous or infamous of them is Operation Gladio in Italy, where the U.S. Or through the networks of people in the CIA coordinated with members of the Italian government, members of the Italian military, ex-fascist paramilitaries and mercenaries, to basically interpenetrate left-wing groups, create a sense of terror that the communists were causing, and help develop Italian politics in what was known as a strategy of tension. But right, this is sort of the MO in which the CIA is more competent, and it kind of gets its training wheels, or it moves on from its training wheels to use narco trafficking for stay behind armies to affect larger geopolitical ends, right? And at the same time, right, this is the era when the CIA is involved in several coups, right? These are mainly Latin American ones, but there's also Iran with Mossadegh in 1953, and Patrice Lumumba in I think 1961 in Congo. But these were efforts for American covert arts, cloak and dagger type stuff, to remove leaders who were insufficiently favorable to American geopolitical ends. Right. So in the case of Guatemala, which is pretty close to Nicaragua, it's about removing another peasant redistributist named Jacobo Arbenz. And even internal CIA reports kind of say, look, he's not really anything more than FDR. He's not a communist. But even so, he was a threat to corporate holdings in Guatemala, mainly bananas, which if you never thought a coup could happen because of bananas, you'd be wrong. Similarly, the CIA helped form regional intelligence networks. They were involved during the election of Allende in Chile. And Allende was a socialist. He was a self-professed Marxist. He had won in a democratic election. And without getting into rehashing that whole story, Allende was overthrown. He commits suicide as the military turns against him. And the general in charge, Pinochet, kind of creates a reign of terror, exterminating numbers of leftists or critics of the regime, including more center-left critics like Orlando Letelier, who was a member of the Christian Democratic Party. And he was blown up in Washington, D.C. in 1973 by a car bomb. So, even that was like a step too far, and Pinochet's regime got chastised. But just sort of shows you how far, this kind of backlash could go. And the CIA, according to at least some scholars of this, like John Dinges, there's sufficient evidence to show that the CIA helped coordinate Chile's interregional intelligence dragnet called Condor, which was how several regimes who were kind of military governments, specifically right-wing oriented, to kind of scoop up all the enemies of the regime and kind of exterminate them or lock them up, which also involved in Argentina's dirty war. Now, into all of this, right, that these forces are kind of coalescing is the Reagan administration, particularly Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North, who's also on the National Security Council, and what he termed the enterprise, right? North was not going to let Nicaragua become another Cuba. It wasn't going to become another communist stronghold in Latin America. And so Ollie North would do whatever it would take to remove, and he's not the only one. He's just sort of the face because he gets, we'll see why. But he and several others in the Reagan administration and outside the Reagan administration, and this isn't just a Republican thing, we'll see. They want to remove the Nicaraguan revolutionary government, but Congress had been unwilling. The Bolin Amendment, which was passed, restrained how much, first of all, it said that the United States was not going to overthrow the Sandinistas directly. We're not going to give guns to the Contras. Congress is not going to pay for that. But, and any help we give has to be strictly humanitarian. But this is not going to help the Contras win. The Contras are sort of camped out in the jungles of Nicaragua. They have some bases in Honduras and in Panama, which are neighboring countries. And they need, they need the funds, right? So how is Ollie North going to pay for this? And so this is where the CIA enter. They're probably already involved, but this is sort of the direct moment of overlap between the needs of anti-communists in the elected government, members of unelected, this is what's called popularly known as sort of the deep state, these unelected officials who nobody knows about, but may exert power over what elected officials can do and what they can't do. But nevertheless, right, it's not, it's an open conspiracy, right? This is sort of how people talk about it. But Oliver North and the CIA sort of find this conjunction, and this is the enterprise for using drugs and guns to help the Contras win. All right. And so, some of this stuff is in pop culture already. This is a kind of poorly made buddy comedy movie that's about heroin traffic from Southeast Asia and the Golden Triangle, linked to the CIA's, or particularly Paul Helliwell and another guy named Ted Shackley. Their role in the Civic Air, what is it, Civic, the CAT, Civic Air Traffic. or civic air transport. Sorry, and there's a lot of acronyms. But this kind of morphs into Air America, and that's what this movie's about. Similarly, right, Reagan loved the Contras, and he was involved in kind of fighting them off. Okay, so how did this all work? Now, the drug trafficking element was through, maybe some of you are familiar with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, but they were the big coke providers in Colombia. At the time, a guy by the name of Manuel Noriega had taken control of Panama, and he sort of double dipped as a drug dealer and the president and the sort of military head of the country. So from Panama and also some places in Honduras, planes would land and take off, moving the cocaine from Colombia there, from which weapons would be traded or the cocaine would be loaded up, and the coke would be sent either to the East Coast, mainly to Miami. And, I could go on and on about Florida. Florida is one of the shadiest places in the Union, but it would be moved to Miami, where anti-Castro Cuban mafia types would connect with fellow mafia members in the five families in New York, the Italian mafia, some Jewish mafia figures like Meyer Lansky, who was also set up in Florida, and they would move it up and down the coast. And then the other main pipeline was to Los Angeles on the West Coast, and this coke would be moved. I mean, there's all these other lines, and we'll get to Berry Seal because there's some being dropped off in Louisiana, Arkansas. It's also a whole other thing that we're about to dive into. But briefly, right, they're also piping this into Los Angeles, mainly to the Crips and the Bloods and a few other gangs that operated as sort of the distribution network. And Contras were actively involved in this whole process. So the guy at the bottom left there is a reporter by the name of Gary Webb. There's a movie made about him called Shoot the Messenger. But he breaks the story about Contras and gangs, and basically that effectively there was an outrage that the CIA had allowed the Contras to do drugs or sell drugs to gangs, which caused the crack epidemic in South Central LA, right? So it felt like the government was killing Black people on purpose, right? They didn't care, right? And there's sort of parallels to, without getting into it too much, to the current opioid epidemic throughout Middle America. But Gary Webb was sort of blacklisted, and he shot himself twice in the head and committed suicide. At least that's what the police reports say. So who knows, right? I don't know how you shoot yourself twice, but there you go. All right. So, and just to kind of briefly fill that in, some of you might be familiar with Rick Ross, but he actually stole that name from the real Ricky Ross, Freeway Rick, as he was known, who led the largest distribution center, and his connect for coke and crack was this Contra member named Danilo Blandon. And I can get into more of that later if you ask in the Q&A. All right, we'll just skip past that quote, but effectively, right, there was a congressional committee looking at this later, and effectively, right, this is the findings that they had concluded. Now, getting on to Berry Seal, right? This is the world in which Berry Seal dwells, right? So it's a world of geopolitical struggle between communism and anti-communism. At least that's the ideological justification. Of course, as we've seen, there might be deeper business connections about what communism even means and whether someone's overthrown because they're a communist, and to what extent that actually matters. But never, I'll kind of leave that off. But you see this web of global cloak and dagger intelligence, being willing to use drug trafficking to fund paramilitaries to fight against hostile regimes. And this is the world, and then also, right, gangsters, criminals who are engaged in drug distribution, drug trafficking, and so on, right, making a lot of money. And that's where Berry Seal comes in. All right, So a real quick sketch of his life. Barry Seal he's born in Louisiana. He joins the Civil Air Patrol in 1955 under David Ferry he was actually probably met Lee Harvey Oswald for people who are in on the JFK type questions. But at some point, he became a contact pilot for the CIA. In 1972, he was arrested in Los Angeles on a flight to Mexico carrying plastic explosives. And that was sort of the first time he appears above water. But as this photo in the top right shows, which was taken in 1963 in Mexico City, right, he obviously had a much longer career. Many of the people in this photo are part of what was called Operation 40, which was a CIA and anti-Castro Cuban network to try to figure out how best to prevent communism throughout Latin America and how to overthrow Castro. So in this photo, pointing at Barry Seal, but next to him is Porter Goss, who will go on to be the head of intelligence during the Bush era in the 2000s. Right next to Porter Goss is Felix Rodriguez, who's a famous CIA contract killer. He was most known for having captured Che Guevara in Bolivia and supposedly keeps his hands in a jar of formaldehyde over somewhere on his desk. But that's probably a legend. And then, also in this picture is Frank Sturgis, who's a Watergate burglar. He's covering his face with his jacket. But, this just shows you, this is one of the strangest pictures you might ever see, but it just shows you how far back it goes. Now, when Barry Seal starts flying, he somehow gets connected with the Medellin cartel in the mid-70s. Between the 70s and when he's finally killed, 1986, that we'll get to, he makes between $3 and $5 billion from sales. Originally, Barry Seal, he forms his own company, which is bankrolled by someone, right? In the American-made movie, they very clearly show CIA connections, but Barry Seal and fellow contract pilots start moving drugs into the New Orleans area and moving guns when the Contra War starts picking up into down south, right? 1982, things get a little hot in New Orleans, and so Barry Seal moves to Mena, Arkansas. In 1983, the DEA bust him for drug trafficking and recruit him as an informant. At the same time, he's continuing to make his flights. Oliver North kind of tasks him to get proof that it's not the Contras who are dealing drugs, it's actually the communists. And they focus on this very shady guy named Federico Vaughn, who may or may not actually have been a Sandinista or of any real, just because he's he has some small government office, but what his motives were sometimes difficult to discern, but I could get into that more later. In 1984, North leaks a photo that Seal had been taking with his plane, showing Federico Vaughn with himself and with Pablo Escobar, trying to create enough pressure for Congress to vote more funds for the Contra effort, right? The Boland Amendment had been blocking them. Humanitarian efforts were not sufficient to equip them. So they basically throw Seal to the wolves. Seal refers to himself during this period as a clay pigeon, right? He's just being used at this point. Now, at some point, right, he gets arrested, he gets let off. The IRS is also harassing him for tax evasion and fraud. But at some point, Seal, I know, he crossed the wrong line. There's theories about what exactly happened. Was it because he was willing to testify against the Medellin cartel? There's also theories about Seal's personal relationship to George H.W. Bush, which he was, when he was murdered in 1986, supposedly by a Colombian hit squad. Many of the boxes of his kind of blackmail that he would keep, and some of his friends would repute he'd keep all of it in his car, they were all gone. And in his pocket was the personal phone number for the Vice President, George H.W. Bush. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but see, that's the trouble with deep politics, which is a term coined by Professor Peter Dale Scott. And, it basically refers to this liminal twilight space between elected above board officials, people who work for the government or people who are elected to the government, or have, perfectly legal and legitimate businesses, and their ties to, gangsters, drug dealers, criminals, people who are below the law, below the radar. And in a strange sort of symbiosis or synthesis, they feed off of each other. They use each other for mutual gain or to accomplish overlapping goals. Now, to wrap up real quick, because I know I'm going over the limit, but this sort of pops out in the public attention because when Seal dies in 1986, later that year, right, Reagan sort of uses, again, Seal's photos and things he had accumulated to sort of pin the drug trafficking on the Sandinistas, right? The communists are the ones who are spreading coke all throughout the Americas. But Seal's plane, right, even though Seal died, his plane was inherited by a fellow contract pilot by the name of Terry Reid, and it was shot down over Nicaragua by the Sandinistas. And this is basically what triggers the Iran-Contra scandal. From shooting down this plane, it showed that the United States government was actually moving guns, and they had captured the pilot, they had captured a big haul of illegal goodies, and the Iran-Contra scandal threatened to take down the Reagan administration. And so Oliver North gets pinned with for this, but when President George H.W. Bush pardons him. At the same time, right, when Seal moves to Arkansas, the choice of location was not random. During the 80s, Governor Clinton, William James Clinton, Bill Clinton, he was in charge at that time. And many of the people who were associated with the Clinton government had some finger or attachment to some of the stuff that was happening in MENA. So, for example, when Governor Clinton had passed the creation of the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, the first company to get it was a MENA company called Park on Meter Inc. That was linked to the creation of chemical weapons that was being sold to the Contras. And all throughout this investigation, local cops, sheriff would say, like, I arrest a hillbilly with a pound of weed and he'd go to jail forever, but Barry Seal's flying in and out with all this coke and no one can touch him. Right? What's going on? Judge Charles Black repeatedly gets stonewalled by Clinton, or at least his administration, while trying to investigate these, these goings-ons. And eventually, right in 1996, a congressional report led by Representative Jim Leach finally got the CIA to admit that they had been working in Mena, Arkansas. They were present there. Right? It's still kind of shadowy or whatever. But, this sort of leads to, larger questions of the Clinton era politics, right? For those who remember, Whitewater was a huge thing. And right, Whitewater was linked to shady real estate deals going on, right? Huge amounts of money being made overnight. But everyone forgot about that when Kenneth Starr focused on Monica Lewinsky, right? Was it that, as once a researcher has kind of concluded, either Kenneth Starr was a pervert and he was obsessed with Clinton's sex life, or he was doing it on purpose, derailing, what exactly Whitewater meant. Neither Bill or Hillary Clinton went to jail or were convicted of anything related to it, but several people in his administration who had ties, especially to what's called the Bluegrass Mafia, which is sort of a Southern, criminal outfit. I won't get into that, but some links to them, some links to the Reagan administration, and links to other administrations. So finally, to conclude, right, Barry Seal's life sort of shines a sliver of light on this much more complicated web of light and dark, the shadow world. And this is basically the conclusion, right? If you're listening to all this and you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about or what to make heads and tails of anything, this is the same conclusion that Senator John Kerry, who led the Kerry Commission to investigate these things after Iran-Contra popped up. This was basically his conclusion, right? it's mind-boggling. You have one policy that's about cracking down on drugs. You have one policy about facilitating drugs. You have one policy helping these people and one policy to hunt these people. It doesn't make any sense. And so for cops out there, right, what's the point of them trying to bust drug dealers and putting their life on the line if there's a whole other second parallel policy that's getting those guys back on the street or replacing them? So it's not really much of a conclusion, but it just shows you that you have to use this analytical frame of deep politics to sort of appreciate some of the more mind-boggling aspects of American politics. And we can't just talk in terms of parties or these solid structures like the government or the state, when it's really much more complex networks of individuals whose allegiances sort of don't fit any one ideological paradigm. It's not communism or anti-communism. It's not liberal or conservative. It's not Republican or Democrat. And scholars, it's hard to connect these dots. There's a lot of shadows in between, but scholars have to use this analytical framework to uncover, in a much more serious and rigorous fashion, why politics, geopolitics in general, right? How different countries and these spaces are all related to each other, especially in terms of resources. But using this framework to get at why these things happen and who benefits and why and what happens next. So thank you.
All right, very well. Thank you, Professor Parks. We appreciate you taking the time and breaking that down for us. It's interesting for me as I used to work for the federal government, and so much of what he just said, we live and die by a simple phrase in the federal government: it's all for the greater good. What that greater good is no one asks. No one gets to ask the questions that Professor Parks just asked. But we certainly appreciate your talk on this. And at this point, we will move to a period of question and answer. So if you have a question for Professor Parks, please put it in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and then I will ask those questions aloud so we can all hear it, and we'll see what he has to say. So please, we welcome your questions in the chat. As we're waiting for questions, I have one to get us started. Professor Parks, this is, especially when you look at your other interest in history, I think we're all intrigued by it, to your point, because of popular culture, but what made you want to pursue Barry Seal and these questions with the CIA, the Contras, and so forth?
Well, he just, when you start looking intently, I took an interest in just trying to figure out, just for totally normal contemporary purposes, why do things happen the way that they do, right? Why, some people, I think it's kind of an obscuring tactic, but some people say, oh, well, it's just random, right? It's just everyone's just sort of doing their own thing. And, a lot of times people are just like Keystone cops. And so, oh, why did Iran-Contra happen? Oh, I don't know, just somebody made a mistake or something. And people say they're sorry, and then somebody goes to jail and everyone feels happy. And I've never been satisfied with that kind of conclusion. So then when you start looking at some of this stuff, you start seeing the same names pop up over and over and over and over again. Some of them are famous names, like, Oliver North or George Bush come up several times. And some of them are much more obscure, right? I'm sure none of you have heard of Terry Reid before, or someone like Ted Shackley. These are basically unknown people, and yet they used an incredible amount of power, and you just see them pop up everywhere, ranging from sitting on the board of some local maritime bank to being put in obscure positions. Shackley was a CIA operative, and having these friendships, connections, and you get a lot of this stuff if you spend time looking at conspiracies, on the internet, and people tend to sort of oscillate, and this is sort of the bad part, oscillate between every connection must be meaningful. So then you get basically what people call conspiracy theories. That it's just kind of crazy wingnut type stuff. Or you just get sort of establishment, um, maybe ready-made kind of answers to things, and then everybody's like a good guy or an idiot. That's nothing happens because of just sort of the more simple base motive of well, I want more power, I want money. How do I do this? How do I accomplish my goals? And when you look at older historical eras, so I study early modern Britain professionally, and there's all sorts of conspiracies and spies and networks and things. And this stuff is more documented because the archives are opened. And these people are all dead, and nobody cares about the Habsburgs or Queen Elizabeth or any of that stuff. All those struggles are done. So I'm kind of interested in just sort of applying similar questions to contemporary moments where the archives are not open, and things like you get incensed when you hear about a guy like Gary Webb. Shoots himself twice in the head. He commits suicide. I mean, what is that, right? And he's writing, and he's being attacked by all these people who have themselves connections to people who benefit from keeping all of this quiet. So it just kind of motivates me to dig deeper, to try to like sketch out some of these questions. And it's really hard because, again, the archives aren't open. And even if they are open, there's code, there's internal memoranda that are not supposed to be read straightforwardly. I mean, there's all sorts of, again, you learn all this stuff reading in like the early modern period or any other earlier period of history globally. And so you think, why wouldn't this still be the case? In fact, it gets more complicated because they're more effective ways to hide things, technologically speaking.
Fair enough. We have a question here. It seems from our distinguished dean, Patrick Grubbs. Dean Grubbs has his hand up, so take it away.
Hi, John. Thank you for the talk today. I had a question that's actually I want to know a little bit about how then you're approaching the classroom if you're teaching like a US2 class. With all the knowledge that you have here of these interconnected webs, how do you talk about the war on drugs that came about domestically in America in the 1980s? Like, do you look at that as a legitimate pursuit of the federal government? That they really thought with all of this that's going on behind the scenes that this was a legitimate cause that there might be an end to? Or like, what is your approach on that when you talk about, what's happening domestically in America in the 1980s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's two kinds of answers to that. I mean, there are a lot of people who are involved in this stuff who are good faith actors. And sometimes, right, horrible things happen to them. There's a whole, for a slightly different thing, there's a DEA officer named Kiki Cameron, who was butchered by a cartel in Mexico investigating drug trafficking. But there's evidence to suggest that his cover was blown. They knew who he was because there was some internal leak from somebody who was connected to the cartels, who was working for either the DEA or some other policing agency that was engaged in the war on drugs. And it's like he investigated the wrong thing. So Kiki, it's not like they're all in on it. That's like the all kind of interpenetrating networks. So a stated policy might be used because it will win you votes. So you want to get involved in the war on drugs because, look, there's chaos in the streets and the U.S. government needs to do something. It makes you look weak if you just shrug your shoulders. And that was a big thing for certain administrations. But the other part of it too, I guess, which was sort of popped out with, for those who are familiar with Operation Fast and Furious, which was it was a DEA related program, but it basically came out that the guns were being confiscated from gangsters to be sold again, or there was, it was like this recycling program. So then sometimes these agencies, they get involved effectively to to muscle in on and reorganize some of the gangs. So it's almost like a big gang like bossing around little gangs. That's not to say, everyone involved is, who's like in the DEA is like the equivalent of like a cartel member or like a Blood or a Crip or something. But some of them certainly act that way. When you find out about these policies, that it's like, oh, we don't care about the guns. We just want to take the guns from the weak gang that's not listening to us and then give them to another gang who will sell or do what we want. And, in the classroom, I guess it's just trying to like sculpt, you got to carve out that these policies can have like multiple intentions behind them, and you can't just read the surface. Oh, it's against drugs, so I guess the government just wants the drugs off the street, or everyone involved in government is wants to do this. But then, right, you're confronted with the question, like, why doesn't it work? And some people just say, well, you can't, it'll never work. But then sometimes I think, sometimes it's designed to fail or not to work in the way that you think it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating that, Nancy Reagan was this, this main person behind the Just Say No movement that begins in the 1980s. And, this is the first lady of, what the period that you're talking about this interconnected drug cartel is like ramping up under her husband's administration. So I find it very fascinating. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Question here from Joseph. He says, Professor Parks, do you think that the CIA adapted its drugs for guns tactics of the war of drugs to fit the modern war on terrorism in the Middle East?
So I try to give the long perspective, just mentioning things like the U.S. in like 1907 invading Nicaragua because of mining company interests, because I think, these movements can threaten or bolster basically business deals, which, it might sound kind of sick to think about it, but some people do basically, as Sam and I were talking before this chat, some people look at people basically as dollar signs. What's the worth of a human life? What can you get out of them? And the war on drugs and the war on terrorism are connected sequentially and also kind of contemporaneously. They happen at the same time, but then the war on drugs happens before war on terror. But they both get the government get the people to back government efforts to be involved in wider conflicts, right? So many Americans didn't know what Nicaragua was, and why were we planning on sending our tax dollars to arm people to shoot the other people, right? So you had to explain, why do we have to be there, right? Why would we invade this country or that country, right? Congress is supposed to be accountable to its voters, right? So, and congressmen, right, are not all keyed in on what exactly figures in various agencies or government bodies are doing. So they want to know. And so you have to, it's like stage managing. Are there legitimate reasons to, that motivate people to support policies on the war on drugs or war on terror? Yeah. But at the same time, there are also all sorts of things, right? I mean, just as one example, now, without establishing any kind of causality, a few months before the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in the year 2001, the Taliban took an anti-heroin policy. They started slashing and burning all the poppy fields. And within about a year, the poppy output of Afghanistan, which was the largest in the world, tanked. After the United States invaded Afghanistan, within a year, poppy rates were back on course. And there are anecdotes from U.S. soldiers who said, I was basically like a security detail for a warlord who farmed poppy to be turned into heroin and to be sold. So, what am I doing here? What am I doing there? But, right, this is a reason, right? We're fighting the Taliban. We're fighting Al-Qaeda. We're fighting global terror. And so, these causes kind of intermingle, and it gets you to do the same thing, which is about pursuing certain people's interests, maybe at the expense of the American people or the people of Afghanistan or people of whatever country or whatever it might be.
Another question here, Mateen asks if you could explain what Operation 40 is, the CIA op, but if you could kind of explain what that is.
It was, to just put it briefly, it was an informal group. So it's called Operation 40, but it's just a group of about 40 people, some of whom were anti-Castro Cubans who had left, who had exiled themselves from Cuba and set up in places like Miami, Florida, and, you know, throughout the state. And then, you know, government intelligence officials, and they collaborated, mixing the resources of underground mafia with above ground government, right? This is the whole deep politics, shadow world stuff, to coordinate plots to either overthrow Castro or to stop Castro affiliated or communist affiliated movements elsewhere. And they were set up in Florida, but then they were also set up in Mexico, which was sort of a cloak and dagger space because Mexico was officially neutral. It wasn't pro-US, it wasn't pro-USSR. And so Mexico City was a hub for a lot of shady stuff. So Operation 40 was that group, and that was their MO.
All right, question here from Matt. He says, how much conflict relatively arises from the separation or censorship of uncoordination between the agencies within the U.S. proportional to the external factors?
So, you know, it's you know, any kind of organization depends on middle management. The people at the top are only able to do what they do because they know what people beneath them are doing. Right? They get reports from these people, and then they have to, you know, all these people work under them, and they compile stuff, and then this is delivered to them. So that's why you can end up with, you know, heads of companies not knowing there's all sorts of illegal stuff going on underneath them. Maybe that's why they're in charge. Sometimes it's just a figurehead. So sometimes that's the issue. So it's not just the lack of coordination between these different intelligence, right? Agencies, in fact, over the 20th century, you see convergence. The CIA was created, really Harry Truman's intention in drafting the CIA was that it would solve some of these problems, right? He didn't even intend for them to do cloak and dagger stuff. But you know, you need some center source to collect all of the information from State Department, Defense Department. You know, even within the Defense Department, there's Army intelligence, naval intelligence, and so on. And then, right in the 2000s, right, just to jump ahead, right, the Bush era saw even further centralization, where it wasn't just the DCI anymore. It's not the Director of Central Intelligence. I think the acronym's like DCCI or something. But he has sort of, he's over the CIA as well as the NSA and all these other intelligence agencies. And this hasn't stopped this sort of leaking from the middle or this sort of cross-cutting through it. So you actually see the opposite. Further centralization actually makes it leakier. So it's not just because they're not talking to each other. You know, interagency rivalries sometimes obscure these kind of arrangements, but sometimes the interagency rivalries actually exploit them. You actually find out because the DEA does not trust the FBI doesn't trust the CIA doesn't trust the NSA, and someone ends up, you know, poking a hole in something that they didn't know about, and they step in, you know, people get a glimpse of some whole operation that nobody had any idea about.
Other questions? Matt says thank you. Dean Grubbs says, for those of you who enjoyed this talk and want to review previous talks, we are up now on the college website, so you can visit it. I'll provide that link right here. Oh, there it is. Yep, northampton.edu/Spartan Talks. We are nearing the 12 o'clock hour. We have one more question. This will be our last question from Fernando, and then we'll wrap up. Fernando asks, I previously read about Barry Seal, and to my understanding, after being captured, he confessed to having transported around $3 billion worth of cocaine. He was only sentenced to 10 years before turning into an informant. Why do you think he was initially sentenced to such a short time?
I think so. So with someone like Barry Seal, and this is sort of again what you find out about some of this stuff. He's not an idiot. He's very street smart. He, from some of the recollections of his friends and family who still are living, he like compiled lots of blackmail on people. So there's a you don't want to. So on the one hand, they're trying to get Barry Seal to do something new. So if you slap him with too heavy a sentencing, he might just unleash all this information and embarrass lots of these people. But on the other hand, you want to make it seem like you're serious. So we'll put you away. You got to give him a way out. But what's even worse to me is when he gets killed, the judge puts him out on probation. And Barry Seal actually wants to go to jail because he thinks it would be safer in a federal penitentiary than to be like wandering the streets. And then that's when he's assassinated. He gets sent to like a halfway house, and he kind of recognizes it's a death sentence. So some of these sentences don't reflect necessarily any code of justice, but might reflect kind of political needs, what you can get out of somebody, or maybe in this case, like maybe you wanted Sealed gone, and whether it was the Colombians who did him in or somebody who paid Colombians to kill him, whichever, like you're just sort of hoping he goes away. So you see that as possible reason for that.
Yeah, I think there's always a lot of nuance behind some of these decisions the government makes, certainly more than meets the Twitter feed. So it is 12 o'clock. So Professor Parks, again, just want to say thank you for this talk, for a fascinating history. For those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can certainly put you in touch with Professor Parks. I also, and I'm going to put this in the chat function here, we have 2 Spartan Talks upcoming. And when we return from our spring break next week, Professor Mary Pickett from English is going to be speaking the next Tuesday, March the 23rd. She'll specifically be talking about writer's block. As a writer herself, and going through ideas I think will be beneficial to faculty and students alike. And then on the week after, March 30th, Michael McGovern from our history department will be giving a talk about baseball right in time for opening day. And so those are upcoming, so please be on the lookout for those. But again, I want to thank everyone for being with us. Again, John, thank you for joining us and for this talk. And to Dean Grubbs' point earlier, if you want to review past talks, it's northampton.edu/Spartan Talks. With that, we wish all of you a good week, and we hope to see you back here on March 23rd.